Imagine walking down the street, minding your own business, when an unmarked van pulls up. The doors open and masked men leap out and grab you. You're hauled inside, blindfolded, tied up, and told if you keep quiet, you'll be all right. Maybe. You have just been kidnapped. Your fate is now in the hands of a bunch of thugs who plan to use you to demand money or leverage in some kind of deal. Will you make it out alive? Who knows? It's all out of your control. There have been many famous kidnappings over the decades. The disappearance of the Lindbergh baby in 1932, which ended with the child dead. John Paul Getty III, part of the ultra-rich Getty clan, was taken in Rome by an Italian organized crime group in 1973. When the family was slow to pay the ransom, they cut off his ear and sent it to them. Patty Hearst, the newspaper heiress, was kidnapped by the radical Symbionese Liberation Army in California in 1974. She was later caught on security camera with her captors robbing a bank. Then there are the horrific stories of abduction and confinement. Natasha Kampusch was snatched when she was 10 and held in a secret cellar under the home of Wolfgang Pricklupil for 8 years. J.C. Dugard was taken at age 11 in California and kept locked up by a husband and wife team for 18 years before she was found. And back in 1966, 17-year-old Peggy Bradnick was grabbed in Pennsylvania by a mountain man named William Holenbaugh. It took a massive manhunt, the largest in the history of the United States at the time, to find her. Musicians are not immune from such horrors. In fact, you may be surprised at how many have been kidnapped and by who. I'm Alan Cross, and this is episode 60 of Uncharted Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry. And we're simply going to call this one Kidnapped. Kidnapping is one of the most serious of all crimes. Arbitrarily confining and denying a person's freedom in exchange for ransom, or something worse, occupies plenty of law enforcement's time. And this crime has been a bigger deal in the music world than you might realize. The first documented case of a musician being kidnapped goes all the way back to the case of Solomon Northup, a freeborn mixed-race man. Northup was not only an accomplished violinist, but also an abolitionist, something that did not sit well with those in favor of slavery in the United States. In early 1841, Northup, who was born in New York State, was offered a gig in Washington, D.C. It was a traveling musician's job, which sounded pretty good to him. He should have probably taken more notice of the fact that slavery was still legal in D.C. at the time. He met up with Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton in New York City. They claimed to be entertainers who needed musicians for their circus. They then convinced him to travel to D.C. "It's good pay," they said, "and we'll pay for all your expenses." Along the way, Northup secured his free papers, documents that proved he was a free black man. This shouldn't have been a problem because an 1840 law in New York State made it illegal to capture people for the purposes of slavery. But in 1841, one of America's biggest slave markets was in Washington, D.C., and no one cared about any New York laws. Slave catchers were everywhere, looking to grab anyone, transport them south, and then sell them into servitude. Brown and Hamilton, if that was their real names, were in on it. Once in Washington, Northup was drugged, probably with laudanum, belladonna, or possibly both. In this incapacitated state, he was sold to a slave trader named James Birch for $650. "He's a fugitive slave from Georgia," they lied. "He's yours." Northup was thrown into a pen with other men, women, and children before being shipped by sea to New Orleans on a boat that was festered with smallpox. Northup was sold to a Baptist preacher named William Ford. He was then sold to a carpenter named John Thibault, and he was a cruel man who almost had Northup lynched. Eventually, Thibault rented Northup to a plantation owner named Eldreet, and then he was sold to a man named Edwin Epps. He was very cruel too, and Northup was enslaved by him for 10 years. But then, in 1852, Northup met Samuel Bass, a Canadian carpenter who agreed with his abolitionist views. Over the next 4 months, Bass worked the legal system hard and was eventually successful in getting Northup his freedom. The date was January 4th, 1853. Northup made it back to New York where he wrote a memoir. Maybe you've heard of it, 12 Years a Slave, which was made into a movie in 2013. The memoir was a major hit with abolitionists and helped sway public opinion in the North further against slavery. This entire time, Northup played the violin wherever and whenever he could. His last years were spent working as a carpenter, and he died in either 1863 or 1864. Our next kidnapping case involves Fats Waller, the famous jazz musician of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. He had hits like Ain't Misbehavin', St. Louis Blues, and Honeysuckle Rose, songs that sold well as both sheet music and as 78 RPM records. Fats loved to perform. If you wanted him on your record, he was there. Got a nightclub looking for performers? Fats was game. Needed someone to play a party? No problem. In 1926, the Victor Talking Machine Company had a job for him. Would he come to Chicago to record a few sides? You can probably get a few nightclub gigs while you're here too. Fats accepted. On May 21st, 1926, after he'd wrapped up another job at the Sherman Hotel, he walked outside only to be confronted by 4 white men standing next to a swanky sedan. They had guns. "Get in the car," they said. Fats feared the worst. A black man in mob-controlled Chicago? This did not look good. Fats was driven across town to the Hawthorne, a small 3-story hotel in Cicero, a suburb in the west. This was the headquarters of Chicago's biggest gangster, Al Capone. "Get out of the car," he was ordered. Fats was marched into the hotel, where a big party was already underway. It was Capone's 27th birthday celebration. Capone, you see, was a huge jazz fan. There's a story of him tearing a $100 bill in half in front of a clarinet player named Johnny Dodd. Capone gave him half. "You get the other half after you learn this song that I want to hear." Fats had no idea what was going on until he spotted Capone. "I love what you do," Capone said. "You'll stay here and play until the party's over." So he did, and the party lasted 3 days. The entire time, Fats was treated very well. The food was fantastic, and he had all the booze he could drink. There were times during the party when gangsters tipped him $100 to play a request. No stopping either. When he had to sleep, he just put his head down on the piano for a few minutes. Fats gave it his all, playing the piano and organ for hours at a stretch. He told jokes and basically gave the audience a really good time, and after a while, he didn't want to leave. When it was over, Waller had thousands of dollars in cash in his pockets. He was put back into the car and driven back to the hotel. He never, ever made that kind of money again before he died in 1943. But questions remain. Did the kidnapping and forced performance caper really happen? Stories like this have a way of becoming embellished over the years. What we do know is that Fats was taken by gangsters to this hotel. He was told to perform, or else, and he was paid well and released. But how much of the other part of the story is true? It does appear that Fats was forced to perform for a bunch of gangsters for a weekend in 1926, but there was no photographic evidence or eyewitness testimony to back it up. No one was ever arrested or charged. Was Capone involved? It's unclear. Was he even at the party? Again, unclear. But all this sure made for a great story. Let's skip ahead to December 8, 1963. Frank Sinatra Jr., son of you-know-who, and someone who knew a thing or two about the mob, was in Lake Tahoe, Nevada. Frank Jr. was 19, and he was rehearsing for a stand at Harrah's Club Lodge Casino with a Tommy Dorsey band. At 9 p.m. that night, Frank Jr. was in his dressing room with his friend Joe Foss. There was a knock on the door. "Who is it?" he asked. A voice on the other side of the door said, "I have a message for you, Mr. Sinatra." Frank Jr. opened the door to find 3 men, Barry Keenan, his high school buddy Joe Amsler, and John Irwin. Keenan, the ringleader, had a gun. "Be quiet, and everything will be just fine," he said. Keenan was 23 years old and had no criminal history, but he did have an inflated sense of self-importance, a classic narcissist. Keenan had this belief that he was too special, too smart for a normal life. He was owed greatness, or at least a lot of money. He was sure he could orchestrate a non-violent kidnapping that would have a celebrity pay a lot of money, and then he would just walk away. Sinatra wasn't his first choice of victim. He thought about grabbing the sons of Bob Hope and Bing Crosby, but he settled on Frank Sinatra Jr. because at 19, he was probably tough enough to handle the ordeal. The plan was to kidnap Sinatra in November, but things were delayed because of all the confusion around the assassination of JFK. They followed Frank Jr. from city to city until everybody got to Reno. Sinatra was tied up, blindfolded, and gagged. They got him into the trunk of a car and drove to California. Sinatra's friend, Joe Foss, was able to free himself and called the cops. Roadblocks were set up within 40 minutes, and the kidnappers were actually stopped at one, but were able to talk themselves out of a search. Frank, of course, was in the trunk. It didn't take long for Frank Sinatra Sr. to get the message. "Give us $240,000 and the kid doesn't get hurt." That's about $2.5 million in today's money. Blue Eyes didn't flinch. Attorney General Bobby Kennedy offered help, as did Sam Giancana, one of the biggest mob guys in the country. Sinatra Sr. cooperated with the FBI. "Get the cash and we'll track the bills," the G-Man said. The money acquired, the FBI photographed all of it, and it was put into a suitcase. The next morning, this is December 9th, 1963, Frank Sr. got a phone call from John Irwin. "Go to Ron's filling station in Carson City, California, and wait for further instructions. All communications will be carried out through payphones." Frank made sure he always had at least 10 dimes in his pocket for these phone calls. In fact, the one thing that grounded Frank Sr. at this time was a lucky dime that he kept in his pocket. Sinatra Sr. figured that as long as he had that dime, things would turn out all right. Sinatra Jr. was shuffled from place to place, cheap motels in Southern California, before settling on a place in Canoga Park. Most of the time, he was in handcuffs and often blindfolded. In the early morning hours of December 11th, Sinatra Sr.'s people delivered the money to an agreed-upon drop-off point in Los Angeles. $240,000 in a suitcase, all in cash, left between two school buses next to a Texaco station. Irwin stood guard over their prisoner while Keenan and Amsler went for the money. But he got nervous and decided to free Frank Jr. early. Frank Jr. flagged down a truck driver, was taken to the nearest police station, and his family notified. He'd been in captivity for 54 hours. To avoid publicity, Frank Jr. was delivered home in the trunk of a police car. After that, things moved fast. John Irwin, one of the kidnappers, freaked out and turned himself in after confessing to his brother, who then called the FBI office in San Diego. And Keenan, the smart narcissist, wasn't so smart after all. Phone calls were traced, and he left clues about his whereabouts after the kidnapping. His accomplices were a little dim, and he didn't think through his exit strategy. And by December 14th, 6 days after the kidnapping, all the kidnappers were in custody and all the money recovered. The trial took place in the spring of 1964. All defendants, through their attorney, a woman named Gladys Root, claimed that Frank Jr. had orchestrated the whole thing as some kind of publicity stunt. There was no evidence of this. How could he explain the confession letter that Keenan had left in a safety deposit box? All three were found guilty. Ringleader Barry Keenan was sentenced to life, but paroled after 7 years, and became a successful real estate developer while portraying himself as the victim in this whole thing. Joe Amsler initially got 75 years, but was also paroled after less than 5. John Irwin, 20 years, but he was also let out in less than 5. As for Frank Jr., he suffered long-term psychological trauma. His relationship with his father became frayed, and his career was derailed for years. And Frank Sr., when he died in 1998, he was buried with those 10 dimes in his pocket. Frank Jr. passed away in 2016. One more note, Dean Torrance of the 60s group Jan and Dean was found to have contributed $1,000 in seed money to the kidnappers. He was never prosecuted for anything because he swore that he had no idea what this seed money was used for. When we come back, we'll look at more cases of kidnapping, including several where the musician committed the crime. In the late aughts, Amy Ann Duffy was a rising star from Wales. Known just as Duffy, She was cut from more or less the same cloth as Amy Winehouse, with a blue-eyed soul and neo-soul sound and image. But she had a long road to get there. In 1998, when she was 14, she had to spend time in a police-protected safe house when cops uncovered a plot by her stepfather's ex-wife to have him killed by a hitman. That woman was eventually arrested and sent to jail for 3.5 years on the charge of soliciting murder. The whole thing was so traumatic that Duffy ran away to her biological father, and then after that, her teenage years were troubled. But then she discovered music. By 2003, she was appearing on TV and recording songs while simultaneously recording at a fish and chip shop. A meeting with Bernard Butler of Suede really got things rolling, leading to a deal with Rough Trade Records and then later A&M. In 2008, she released a debut album called Rock Ferry, which spawned that hit Mercy and a few others. But she found the pressure of fame almost intolerable and almost quit the business entirely, but decided to push on, recording a second album in 2010 entitled Endlessly, and it too did well. But there were problems. She was sued by a former manager, which prompted her to take a break from recording and performing. And then, in October 2012, her rented London penthouse caught fire, but she managed to escape. Scary stuff for someone who had a single called Smoke Without Fire. After that, Duffy disappeared. Just gone. And we didn't hear anything from her for years. And then, on February 25th, 2020, she posted something very scary on her official website. She disclosed that she'd been raped and drugged and held hostage over some weeks. We don't know who the attackers were, nor do we know when this happened. Duffy later elaborated a little. She says she was out at a restaurant celebrating her birthday when she was drugged, probably with something in her drink. She was then taken to a foreign country on a plane, which she doesn't remember, and taken to a hotel. There she was drugged and raped. This, she says, went on for 4 weeks. Again, we have no details on her captors. She thought about running away, but she didn't have any money, and she was afraid that her captor would report her as a missing person, and then the police would simply cooperatively deliver her back to her kidnappers. Duffy was then flown back to the UK, where she was drugged in her own home for another 4 weeks. She can't remember if she was raped during this time. Eventually, though, it all came to an end. A neighbor found her on her balcony behaving like a very ill zombie. Duffy was encouraged to go to the police, but she was too frightened. She was afraid whoever did this to her would come back and kill her. When she made this public in 2020, Duffy also said that the ordeal forced her to stay almost completely alone for 10 years as she received therapy for the severe trauma she suffered. She did write this, though. Rape stripped me of my human rights to experience a life with autonomy from fear. It has already stolen 1/3 of my life. Deep down, I do know it would have been a shame and done immense disservice to my existence to just delete myself and forget what I had experienced in music publicly. It was also not just my burden. So many others live with the big question too of what happened? The record label, live agents, promoters, publicists, musicians, stylists, hairdressers, makeup, lighting, production crew, people I would meet, people I once knew. No one, utterly no one, knew what happened. It kept me removed from those I could actually trust. Mostly, I did not want to trouble anyone else with what I had experienced. She signed off that post with this: I can now leave this decade behind, where the past belongs. Hopefully, no more "what happened to Duffy" questions. And now you know. And I am free. Let's talk about a few more notable kidnapping cases. A lot of musicians have been snatched in Mexico, largely by drug cartels. Starting in about 2010, Combo Colombia, a 12-person group from Monterrey, kept getting bigger and bigger. They played tons of live dates and were often seen on TV. In the early morning hours of Friday, January 25, 2013, 18 people, all members of the band and their crew, were kidnapped in the municipality of Hidalgo in the border state of Nuevo León. They had just played a private party at a bar called La Carretera. The music stopped when several armed men showed up. They forced the band and their crew into trucks and sped away. They were driven around for hours, being beaten and constantly questioned about drugs and any affiliations the band might have had with other cartels. The trucks eventually took them to a ranch called Las Estracas. Everyone was taken out of the trucks and forced to their knees. And then they were executed. Everyone except one of the members of the entourage, who managed to escape and contact police. 5 days later, 17 bodies were found in a well. The whole case was not only horrific, but unexplained. Combo, Colombia had no known affiliation with any drug gang or cartel. We don't even know who carried out the killings, although suspicions lie with the Sinaloa cartel. The case remains unsolved. Something similar happened in 2025. A group called Grupo Fugitivo were somehow targeted by a gang called Metros, who were known to associate with the Gulf Cartel. On May 25, 2025, the group was contacted about a gig and told to report to an address in the city of Reynosa, which is on the U.S. border with Texas. When they got there, all they found was an empty lot. The singer was late, and by the time he arrived, there was no sign of his bandmates, their SUV, or any of their instruments and gear. He called the cops. The SUV was found abandoned 3 days later a few kilometers away. All the gear was dumped at another location. The 5 guys who did show up on time were taken to a rural property and executed. Almost 20 people have been arrested in connection to the case, although it's still not clear what the band had to do with any cartel. And I'm still not done. On August 18, 2013, Alex Band, the lead singer of the group The Calling, was walking to a nearby convenience store after performing at a music festival in Lapeer, Michigan. This was around 3 a.m. 2 strangers forced him into a blue minivan, and they started beating him while one put a gun to his head. He was driven to somewhere else in town, robbed of $1,200, and left for dead. The only reason he survived, he said, is because he told his captors that he was going to become a father in a few weeks. He suffered a fractured lower spine, 3 broken teeth, internal bruising, and a wound to his chin that required 15 stitches. After a performance in Benin City, Nigeria on October 3rd, Oseyomor Joseph, a local star and protest singer, was kidnapped after his car was hit by a hail of bullets. He was dragged into the forest by 7 armed men, all of whom had AK-47s. He was then taken by motorcycle and boat somewhere deep into the forest. They kept him until his family and friends agreed to pay about $30,000 in ransom. He needed 2 weeks in hospital to recover. And finally, there was Itay Kashti. He's an Israeli music producer. In March 2025, he was lured by 3 men to a cottage in rural Wales. He thought this was some kind of songwriting or producing job. Instead, he was grabbed and handcuffed to a radiator and told that he would never see his family again unless that family paid a ransom of £1 million. Fortunately, he was able to free himself and escape, and his kidnappers were sentenced to 8.5 years. So there is a pretty extensive list about kidnapping cases in the music industry. Now, you would think that musicians were always the kidnapping victims, right? But what if they were the kidnappers? Rick James was a major funk singer as well as a producer. He was born in Buffalo, moved to Toronto, where he played in a band with Neil Young called the Minor Birds, and then got arrested by American authorities for dodging the Vietnam War draft. Once he got out of jail, he moved to California in the early 70s, and hits like this followed in the 80s.
That girl is pretty kinky. Girls are super freak. I really love to chase her.
The 80s were very good to Rick. He dated people like actor Linda Blair and dancer Debbie Allen. He was buddies with Marvin Gaye. He sold millions of records on his own and helped produce hits for The Temptations and Smokey Robinson. There was also the Mary Jane Girls, more hits with them, and he wrote and produced this for Eddie Murphy in 1985, which hit number 2 on the singles charts. Part of Rick's image was being controversial and provocative. For example, he would often smoke a joint on stage. This was back when simple possession could get you a stiff jail sentence. He got into arguments with MTV about the overt sexuality of his videos. He started feuds with both Prince and Michael Jackson. And there was a scandal when he publicly dated a 17-year-old named Tanya Hijazi. By the end of the 1980s, Rick's career was on the downside. But then MC Hammer came along with the hit You Can't Touch This, which was based on a sample from Super Freak. And that brought in a lot of cash because Rick and his co-writer sued MC Hammer for a share of the songwriting credit. By the 90s, his drug abuse was out of control. He'd been smoking ab since his teens and later moved on to coke and heroin. At one point, he was spending $7,000 a week on drugs, and he did that for 5 straight years. And then came the kidnapping. In the summer of 1991, Rick and his girlfriend Tanya, now 19, kidnapped Frances Alley, believing that she stole cocaine from them. They held her captive for the better part of a week in her own home. Frances was tied up. They tortured her by burning her legs and stomach with a hot crack pipe. She was forced to perform sexual acts, and when she refused, a gun was waved in her face. And the whole time, Rick and his girlfriend binged on coke. On August 2nd, both Rick and Tanya were arrested. The charges were assault with a deadly weapon, aggravated mayhem, forced oral copulation, false imprisonment, and kidnapping. James faced a maximum sentence of life in prison if convicted. Somehow, though, he managed to be released on $500,000 bail, and both he and Tanya pleaded not guilty. While awaiting trial for the Frances Alley case, he did it again. On November 3, 1992, Mary Sauger, a record executive, was invited to a hotel on the Sunset Strip for what she thought was going to be a business meeting with James. But then, high on coke, he assaulted her. She was then held hostage and beaten over the next 20 hours. James was arrested again, jailed, and found guilty on every charge except torture, which was the one that could have automatically sent him away forever. Instead, he was sentenced to 5 years in Folsom Prison. He served 2 and was set free on August 21, 1996. Meanwhile, Mary Sauger filed a $2 million civil suit and won. James was liable for $1 million, while the hotel and its private security firm were ordered to pay $750,000. There was another charge of sexual assault of another woman in 1998, but those charges were later dropped. The rest of Rick James' life was a continuous fog of drugs and related health issues. Back in April 1984, he was found unconscious at his house by a friend, probably from an overdose. In 1998, while performing at Mile High Stadium in Denver, a blood vessel ruptured in his neck, leading to a stroke. He needed hip replacement surgery because so many of his joints had deteriorated due to drug use. It all came to an end on August 6, 2004. The caretaker of his LA apartment found him dead. He was 56. The cause of death was pulmonary failure and cardiac failure, both related to his long-term drug abuse, diabetes, and the stroke. Toxicology results found everything from antidepressants to meth to opioid painkillers to cocaine in his blood. His body was flown back to his hometown of Buffalo, New York, where 6,000 people viewed his body. His ashes are interred at Forest Lawn Cemetery. Eddie Murphy paid for all the funeral expenses. But there is a coda to all this. In 2020, a woman filed a $50 million lawsuit saying that she was raped by James in 1979 when she was 15. That suit was later dropped. And we should also mention Rick's son, Ricardo Matthews. He's serving a 25 to life sentence in California after being convicted on a number of offenses. Here are 2 more quick stories of artists doing the kidnapping. Ariel Castro, infamous for holding 3 women captive in his Cleveland home for over a decade, was a local musician who performed with several bands. And then there's the case of the Swedish rapper known as Yazin. Yazin Mahmoud was arrested and charged with weapons-related offenses in 2018. He went to jail for about 18 months. And then on December 31, 2020, he was arrested on kidnapping charges. He attempted to lure a rival rapper named Einar to a recording studio in Stockholm on behalf of some criminal buddies. Einar had a sketchy reputation, drug crimes, and he once stabbed a man. He was also known to associate with some pretty bad guys. They schemed through encrypted chat, and the kidnapping was called off. But several weeks later, Einar was kidnapped, beaten, and robbed several weeks later by those same shady friends. He was also photographed in humiliating ways, and when the ransom wasn't paid, those photos were leaked on social media. This turned out to be part of a larger criminal enterprise, which was eventually cracked by the police. 27 people were arrested, some charged with attempted murder, robbery, and extortion. The leader of the plot was sentenced to 18 years. Yazin got a 10-month sentence on the charge of conspiracy to kidnap. Another rapper by the name of Havel Khalil was also sent to jail for 2.5 years for aiding and abetting the plot. Yazin served his time and returned to music. But in May 2025, he had to cancel a concert because cops were tipped off that two men were planning to murder him that night. All of this related to gang activities that's found within the Swedish rap scene. As for Einar, well, he was shot dead in an execution-style killing on October 21st, 2021, not long before he was scheduled to testify against a Swedish crime gang. No arrests have been made in the case. Kidnapping is a terrible, frightful crime. Depriving someone of their freedom and bodily rights is dehumanizing and evil. And it happens more often than we'd like to admit, even in the world of music. You can catch up on all episodes of Uncharted by downloading them from your favorite podcast platform. They're all free for the taking. If you have any questions or comments about anything you hear on this podcast, email me at alan@alancross.ca. We can also meet up on all the social media sites, along with my website, ajournalofmusicalthings.com, which is updated with music news and recommendations every single day. And it comes with a free daily newsletter filled with music news, opinion, and music recommendations. And there's my other podcast, The Ongoing History of New Music, which deals with rock music and alternative music throughout the decades. And there are hundreds and hundreds of episodes that you can enjoy all for free. See you next time for more stories of crime and mayhem in the music industry. Episodes arrive every 2 weeks. Technical productions by Rob Johnston. I'm Alan Cross.